I would like to begin by positioning myself in how I came to this work and how I intend to move forward with this work. And then also to, in adult education, it's good for everybody to know just who I am and how I came to be able to hold this kind of space and time for this conversation. So really, my background is primarily in the area of education. I kind of came up through the K-12 system and made some really amazing connections and relationships with strong Indigenous educators who mentored me into a child and youth care program. So my career really started in the public K-12 school system as a child and youth care counselor with a specific for supporting our urban Indigenous youth in inner city schools. And through that work, I found a love for teaching and facilitating and presenting. And then some amazing colleagues in the education system who were teachers and educators were like, you need to go back to school and be a teacher. And so I did. I went to UBC and studied for my teaching degree. And I found a love for communication. And I left my teaching degree to go study television and radio broadcast to learn the art of communication and public speaking. And again, I went back to the education field. But really my passion was, around supporting and engaging my Indigenous community, my local communities, and the communities I had really good and strong relationships with. So I had it in my mind and in my heart and in my spirit to really manifest a position somehow related to healthcare, even though my entire education and training was surrounding education. So I never really saw how I would come to the field of health. But I found one at First Nations Health Authority in early April 2016, actually in early 2016, but it was in April 2016 when I had first landed in health protection at First Nations Health Authority. And that position was Indigenous curriculum designer for a wellness program with the Indigenous wellness team there. And part of that programming, that mandate for that position was really around designing indigenized healthcare curriculum that was specific towards sexually transmitted and bloodborne infection. And harm reduction was an emerging area in First Nations Health Authority for that program. And then of course, in April 2016, our public healthcare emergency was declared by Dr. Bonnie Henry for the amount of overdoses that we were seeing across the province. And so I had dived into a very rich and unique experience of traveling across the province, visiting, having the humble honor and privilege and respect to be able to visit many, many, many First Nations communities across the province, north to south, east to west, large and small fly-in and boat-in communities. And the most profound experience as a cultural person, as a spiritual person, was to sit with communities in a way that was incredibly safe, community building, and just humbling in the way to sit with elders and knowledge keepers and leaders of those communities and talk about what matters most to them, what cultural languages were being spoken, what cultural efforts were being implemented to revitalize cultural aspects and traditions in that community. But all of this, too, was in the context of being invited to those communities to talk about preventing overdose deaths and substance use and implementing harm reduction. So that's kind of how I came to this work, and everything that I'm sharing with you around decolonizing substance use really is just sharing knowledge and wisdom that I have gained with a humble honor of just sitting and listening and being and supporting and following First Nations communities lead this work in a good way. And then I would get my marching orders saying, Len, go forth and say things like this. Don't say things like that. Speak softly. Be careful about the language you use. pay close attention to who's in the room, ask yourself who is not in the room. So that rich experience really kind of expanded my social perception on the value that culture in a time of crisis can play. And so now where I kind of sit and position myself in terms of my career and how I have kind of come to be here today is that I am really now more of a knowledge exchange leader in our community is probably the best way that I can define my career in a non-colonial sense, because everything that I do in my own terms of the way I try to reconcile with myself is to decolonize my professional practice, decolonize my teaching and learning, or learning and teaching. So that's kind of how I show up to this work, and that is how I have kind of what the pathway that has led me here to today. Before I begin, I really do like to start in a good way with a little bit of protocol and intention setting. For protocol, I would like to honor and recognize that I am zooming in to you from my own home traditional territory of Katzie First Nation in North Langley in Walnut Grove. And I honor and recognize that many of you might be on the shared traditional unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations. My father is from Katzie First Nation and my mother is from Musqueam First Nation. So I belong to the Campbell and to the Pierre families. When it comes to intention setting, I really do want to acknowledge that colonization, substance use, overdose deaths can bring up different feelings for each and every one of us, because they are conversations that we don't necessarily have every single day. So certain emotions might arise that could be seen or deemed as the othering of people. And I know that I come to this work with the intention of not othering anybody. I don't want to other us as Indigenous people, you as service providers, or we as service providers, or when it comes to colonization, the colonized and the colonizers, that is not my intention. My intention is to come to this conversation, lead this conversation with an emphasis on respect, kindness, humility, and reciprocity. Because while as I sit behind my monitor as a facilitator and an instructor, I am first and foremost a learner and a co-learner in this learning journey. Everything that you will hear come out of my words today or see on the screen today has been built with that intention of co-learning. So conversations that I get from questions and dialogue following any presentation or lesson enriches my own learning so that I am equipped to kind of continue to represent and hold space for the lessons I have learned over time. As adult learners, it is important to understand why are we here? Why decolonize substance use? Why should we be listening to Len Pierre talk about decolonizing substance use? So we need to address the why. There is a tremendous value in decolonizing substance use. But before we get into what that is, we need to address why it is so important and why it is so crucial. So this is of course, a snapshot of our province, our colonial province in British Columbia. We have 203 First Nations communities across the province. And then, there has been a disruption in our wellness pathways. And that disruption came along the lines of contact and colonialism with early European settlers. And of course, our story does continue when we look forward and in the context of today, that there is ongoing colonialism and colonial violence that we experience as Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, North America. When the overdose crisis came or was declared, because it was here long before it was declared, First Nations Health Authority released some First Nations overdose data. And I think it was later in 2016, maybe it was even 2017. as Indigenous, actually, sorry, as First Nations people, we only make up roughly 3.3% of the overall population. But at the time of the overdose crisis, we were making anywhere from 10 to 13% of overdose deaths that we were seeing in this crisis. And then, of course, with COVID hitting and the surge of overdose deaths across the province being incredibly significant and substantial and devastating to the communities, again, we were overrepresented in that data. So now we make up roughly 16% of overdose deaths that we are seeing since COVID landing on our shores. There was a 93% increase in overdoses from 2019 to 2020, from January to May. And earlier on in those conversations with First Nations communities, elders would remind us with such intention that, you know, one person dying of an overdose does not just affect that one person. That person has a mom, a dad, siblings, cousins, and friends, colleagues. So we can multiply any numbers that we kind of come across. I'm not a data person, and I did not want to share data on this screen. That is not my intention. My intention is to think about the humanity of those numbers. And I think that is so important during this day and age, because 4-5 years into this public health emergency, my sense is, and I wonder if you agree or you find this as well, that we're almost desensitized to the overdose crisis through news media. And it's easy to imagine that if we look at the scarcity and the resources that have been pumped into the pandemic versus the overdose crisis, and the drastic contrast between overdose deaths and the pandemic deaths. So how can this be? How are we overrepresented in that First Nations overdose data? I think about early in 2019, maybe 2018, as a province in our overdose response efforts were finally starting to kind of come down. Very interestingly, our First Nations overdose was kind of going up. And there's messaging, there's storytelling in data when we start to see things like that. And so we talked about it, and one of the things that kind of surfaced was that, you know, we have an overwhelming amount of trauma, grief, loss, and stress in our communities. This we know. We were overrepresented in substance use way before we were overrepresented in overdose data. But what we're really kind of talking about is, why do we continue to see the surge, or how can we not grasp control over our First Nations overdose data? Is that we really need to talk about the lack of access to culturally safe care. And we really need to address anti-Indigenous racism. And not just anti-Indigenous racism in like society, which is a very important topic as well, but interpersonal anti-Indigenous racism. The way we talk about anti-racism with our friends and our colleagues, our systemic racism, and then our societal aspects of racism as well. So this is the context for why we are here having this very important conversation. And that is why I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk that your presence and participation here matters, that we got a lot to work with. We have come such a long way as a healthcare system in a time of reconciliation, but we have so much farther to go. And so your presence and participation here, you know, cannot be understated. And so I invite you to think about and reflect how you might continue this conversation beyond, you know, this virtual summit. How might you use this information, or use this conversation, or use this knowledge personally, professionally, and for those of you who can influence and have the proximity to influence policy, you know, how can you do that with anything that is being shared with you today? So why decolonize substance use? Again, we always want to start with the why. Why are we here? Why do we need to listen to you, Len? Decolonizing substance use really is creating a collective understanding about sensitive and complex topics, especially in close-knit communities. Because in our communities, you know, everybody knows everybody and everybody's related to everybody. And when we put substance use on the table for discussion, you know, we all have these different experiences, different attitudes, different behaviors associated with how we treat substance use and addiction in our community. So to talk about saving lives, reversing overdoses, and implementing harm reduction, we can't do that work if we don't have a collective understanding. More importantly, it was really about making clear linkages between colonialism, trauma, and addiction, which leads into removing blame from people who are experiencing trauma. And then, of course, respectfully balance the tone of conversations and move forward in a good way. And we kind of learned early on in this public health emergency that when we would go into First Nations communities and we would do take-home naloxone training. And we're like, because the community invited us, they said that they would like to do naloxone training, Narcan training, to learn how to protect their own citizens. And so we would come in, we would fly in, boat in, drive in, and sit in band halls, longhouses, sit outdoors, in friendship centers, in gymnasiums, with aunties and uncles, moms and dads, brothers and sisters and cousins, and talk about, we're gonna reverse overdoses. And we put naloxone on the table and we're like ready to start the training. And all these kind of questions started to surface around, well, why? Why do my relatives, why do my community members continue to use substances if they know it's hurting me and my family? Or why do our community members continue to use substances if there's a risk of overdose? It just doesn't make sense. And so we really had to address, you know, the root causes of why people use substances and why people might have a relationship with addiction. So having that common understanding and putting everybody on the same page and the same path forward, putting us all in the same canoe, pointing the same direction, was far more effective than not addressing that big pink elephant in the room. There are 4 primary areas of decolonizing substance use. I also really compare decolonizing substance use to destigmatizing substance use, because at the end of the day, in this public health emergency, stigma is our real enemy here. We are not going to Narcan or naloxone our way out of this public health emergency. We're not. We do need to take a real systemic look and a societal transformation at how we think and treat substance use and addiction in our society. And this is work that we have been invested in as Indigenous communities over the last 4 or 5 years. Part of destigmatizing people who use substances is addressing the missing context. So that is the why. Why do people use substances? Why do people drink? Why do people smoke? Why might people have a relationship with addiction? That missing context, because when, I think it's Oprah Winfrey who says it, when we know better, we do better. Because that's how stigma survives, is when we don't know any better. So I always like to use this model as like a petri dish. If this was a petri dish and it was the petri dish that would make stigma grow really fast and unaddressed, the root causes of addiction and substance use is one of the starting places, the missing context. Outside of context is misinformation. It is way too easy to come across all kinds of incorrect, inaccurate, and stigmatizing information when it comes to substance use, especially at the community level. And there is a relationship between information that is shared in the community and the way that information is mobilized in our professional belief systems when we are treating people who are using substances or in active addiction. Because that misinformation becomes a part of our belief system becomes a part of our thought process, and our thought process informs how we are going to behave when we show up to this work. So addressing misinformation, I also call them myths about substance use, is a key part of our work. The language we use, which I kind of already alluded to, was the language we use informs how we show up to this work, because it informs our belief system and our thought processes. And the majority of the language that we hear at the community level is incredibly stigmatizing. And so we'll unpack some of those language aspects later on. And then, of course, decolonizing substance use and destigmatizing, is really scaffolded and protected by bad colonial policy. I always struggle with this one because I don't know. I really do be quite intentional with the language that I use, and I was trying to come up with some very scholarly or cultural way of saying bad policy, but it's really just bad policy. The colonial policies for prohibition are quite racist, and I'll also cover those later on in this presentation. So to unpack the missing context for why Indigenous people are overrepresented in overdose data and substance use and addictive behaviors, we need to highlight colonialism as one of the root causes. So you see colonization at the bottom of the screen there, and we highlight 3 colonial events: the residential schools, the 60s scoop, and land theft. In each colonial event, we have endured, I must say, that as Indigenous people, in case you're new to the learning of our Canadian context and our colonial history, we have endured many colonial waves in this country. But for the purpose of this example, we'll focus on these 3: residential schools, the 60s scoop, and land theft. From the residential schools, each colonial event will have certain residues that are left behind that in the community. So for example, from residential schools, a sense of fear and shame, usually toward institutions and authority figures. And for us working in healthcare, we do belong to an institution. And for us as service providers, there is a degree of authority in that as well. So sometimes we see that in our own professional experiences working with Indigenous folks, but it comes from colonization, a sense of isolation, and a sense of learned helplessness. And from the 60s scoop, detachment, loss of identity, and most definitely a loss of your own human rights. And from land theft, poverty, lack of housing, and loss of freedom. Now, if we were to pool all of those together and give them a theme, what would we call them? Well, we call them trauma, grief, loss, and drivers and contributors to a sense of one's daily stress. And then normally when we're hosting this dialogue in Indigenous communities with community members, we look around the room when we're looking for that commonality, we're looking for that collective understanding. We pose the question, now can we meet and can we agree that trauma, grief, loss, and daily stress are drivers and contributors to substance use and addiction? And then you see everybody nodding. We're like, okay, we've grabbed that missing context, and now we have that collective understanding. Because when we paint it, or when we put it together in a concept map like what is here, I call this the red map, or the roots of addiction, it almost is inarguable that this is a pathway, the pathway from harm to a way that we use addiction to feel good about something very bad that has happened in one's life or one's experience. Now, when we put addiction on the table for conversation or substance use, quite often, our mind first and foremost goes to drugs, and then alcohol is a really close second. But we like to expand our social perception and make addiction a little bit more relatable. And so we ask the question in session, what are the socially acceptable forms of addiction or a hidden addiction that you can't necessarily see if it's staring you in the face? And so collectively we'll brainstorm, and people will say, well, exercise can be addicting. Gambling can be addicting. Tobacco, caffeine, our phone, our technology, social media can be addicting, and work can be addicting. And so we like to unpack, different ways that we can have addictive behaviors to all cope with trauma, grief, loss, and daily stress. Again, because the intention there is to remove the othering of people who are actively using substances. Because if we're trying to use the othering as an approach, which quite often we use pathologizing language in our own clinical practice, professional practice, by saying substance use disorder or substance abuse, substance misuse. We're constantly othering people by overly pathologizing them. But at the community level, we want to make this really relatable, which is a very ancient Indigenous value. And so by being relating to, because I can relate to a couple of different things in there, whether it's exercise or eating or my own technology, that I can have a relationship with addiction with. So it makes it a little bit more relatable, a little bit more closer to home. And it's about a journey inwards and taking a look at how I do cope from colonialism. Because as Indigenous people, we're all on our own healing journey and we all have different coping mechanisms for that. So it all kind of puts us in the same boat, so to speak. So we remove that othering of people. Two things that I'd like to highlight on this concept map, the roots of addiction. How might this inform us how we, the attitudes that we have about addiction in our community? And secondly, how might this inform how we treat addiction in our communities? We have 203 First Nations communities in this province, and we all pride ourselves in our distinction, how different we are from one another, because something that still exists today is this pan-Indigenous approach that we're all kind of the same. We say, no, we're not. And so we pride ourselves in that difference, that what happens in Katzie First Nation is going to look a lot different than what happens in Stolo territory, or Musqueam territory, or Haida Gwaii, or Tsayo First Nation. But once upon a time, not too long ago, all 203 First Nations communities had this significant value on abstinence-based programming and abstinence-based messaging. Just say no, don't do it, just quit. Why is that? So if we come down the left side of the map here, we're going to land on residential schools. And who ran the residential schools? Religious churches. And religion is all about abstinence-based programming and abstinence-based messaging. Just say no, don't do it, just quit. And it was shared with me by a matriarch in the north, just off the coast of Prince Rupert. We were doing this concept map together. And after saying that, she had told me, well, Len, if we're just recycling, regurgitating, and reinventing that kind of value system on abstinence only, then really we're just recolonizing ourselves. And I was like, mind blown. And I was like, yes. And that is quite typical of some of the colonial ideologies that have made their way into our cultures and traditions and modern day ways of being and governing ourselves. So this was really just about expanding our social perception on a different way of looking at things. Second thing I'd like to highlight on this map is how might this inform us how we treat addiction at the community level. And this is not just for Indigenous people. We see this in the non-Indigenous community as well, that when I have loved ones who are using substances, I love and care for them so much that I want to motivate them into probably making a different lifestyle decision. But quite often, what are our go-to motivators as loved ones who are caring for relatives in active substance use? We try to fear them out of their substance use, or we try to shame them out of their substance use. But if we're using fear and shame as motivators, what we're really doing is contributing to the trauma, grief, loss, and daily stress that's contributing to the addiction. Or sometimes in an institution like a band council or a health center can really look at a known family or a known household who is actively using substances and detach all healthcare services or cultural services from that house and isolate that house or that family from those services. But again, if we're using isolation or detachment as a motivator, what we're really doing is contributing to the trauma, grief, loss, and daily stress that's contributing to the addiction. Now I know that the red map does not paint a pretty picture, and it doesn't sit well, and nor should it. And if there are feelings of discomfort for you, I want to say that that's okay. In fact, it's healthy. And that's actually where I say the magic happens, is when we, take a look at the things that, paint why we need to have these kind of conversations. But as I promised, I don't want to leave you here. I want to, always pivot our conversation, transform our conversation to focus on resiliency, hope, healing, inspiration, and wellness. So there's a quote that I like to use by Dr. Bruce Alexander that goes, the opposite of addiction is not abstinence. The opposite of addiction is connection. That when we feel connected, we don't necessarily have a need or a desire for those addictive behaviors, to things that might be, problematic for us or toxic in some regard. So what is the opposite of addiction in an Indigenous context? Excuse me. Is our sense of community. And the three events that we want to focus on are, a sense of family and friends. And when I say family, I don't mean your blood quantum family, because in some situations, your blood family is not necessarily the best of company that you want to keep. And then within our Indigenous worldview, family is not by blood, family is by relationship. We adopt people into our family, we claim people into our family, and we steal people into our family and say, you're not going anywhere. And that's very, very typical of our cultures. So family, I mean, is, those who you surround yourself, that you love and care for, and know love and care for you too. But we also want to focus on culture and tradition. I like to call those our intergenerational strengths, because quite often when we're talking in health and wellness, we can get saturated in our conversation about our intergenerational traumas. But let's not forget to celebrate our intergenerational strengths, that we are still here, that our culture and tradition, which were outlawed for hundreds of years, is celebrated today. And we have streams of sharing our knowledge through culture and tradition that inform very important aspects of society today. That's something to be celebrated. That's our strength. And then, of course, we want to focus on our nationhood and territory. And then those residues that we've seen on the red map, what are the things that we want to restore, recenter, and revitalize at the community level? Is love, inclusion, purpose, a sense of identity, knowing who I am in this crazy, fast developing modern day world, sense of personal power, knowing what I can and cannot do, and a sense of attachment. And then from nationhood and territory, we really want to restore, community stability, relationships, and self-autonomy, self-governing communities. And then when we'll pull those together, things that we want to restore, recenter, and revitalize are healing, joy, bonding, and peace that are drivers and contributors to one sense of connection. Outside missing context, a big piece of decolonizing substance use and destigmatizing substance use is taking a really critical reflection at the language that we use when we talk about substance use. And we as Indigenous peoples in this country and across Turtle Island have had this piece is really personal for us, because long before I would say racism was a thing in this country, we've had all kinds of derogatory, dehumanizing language applied to us, at us. And so this is something that I invite all healthcare professionals, all allies, accomplices, and community members to really think about dropping the stigmatizing language pieces from their vocabulary. And these are things that I've been teaching and facilitating this for 4.5 years now. And I know that I'm not the only one who says this. I know many of you probably teach this and advocate for this as well. But I still come across this at very important meetings, their regional meetings, their provincial meetings, their board meetings, and I still hear the stigmatizing language come up. And it's quite often because we are in an overdose emergency, and a lot of people are having these conversations, but we're still using that stigmatizing language, which sounds like saying things like user, addict, and clean and sober. And 4.5 years later, we can't say it enough. So I invite each and every one of you, if you are not yet, I know, again, I'm probably preaching to the choir. I want to honor and recognize that for a lot of the things that I'm sharing. I know Vancouver Coastal has done incredible pieces of work through my Indigenous colleagues and connections in that region. But again, it's still there, and it's something that we're all up against. So I invite you, if you are not, to advocate or educate friends and colleagues, you know, should you hear any of those language pieces, because we don't want to be identified by our behavior. We want to be identified as a human, because again, we don't want our belief system to other people or to demean them or reduce their identity to something that is already stigmatized behavior. So of course, we always want to use people first language, people who use substances, people who use drugs, people who drink, people who smoke. And then I'm saying clean and sober. I invite at the community level, at least in our Indigenous community, people to say people on their healing journey. Because it's quite common for a lot of people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to say if they are in recovery or have found their path to abstinence, that they've been clean and sober. And we hear this all the time. Like, hi, I'm Len Pierre. I've been clean and sober for 10 years. And then people will applaud that, which is great. But if I'm a service provider, or I'm just in my, you know, Canadian citizen, I should not be using the language that Len Pierre is, you know, clean and sober for 10 years, because that's not my story. Because if we're using clean as a means to say that somebody is abstinent, what does that mean to somebody who is still actively using substances? That they're dirty? Maybe, maybe not, but our brains do have that kind of good, bad binary when we're substance use. So I invite people to remove the term clean from talking about people who are now abstinent. And I encourage people to say healing journey. All the while fully respecting how people can choose how they self-identify if they're talking about their own story. So if, you know, somebody says that they've been clean and sober for 10 years because that's their story, that's their lived experience, I respect that. But I should not be talking about somebody else's story as clean and sober. So I would never correct somebody and say, what you mean to say is you've been on your healing journey for 10 years. I would never say that, and I don't invite anybody to say that as well. Coming to another quadrant of, you know, decolonial work around substance use is deconstructing the amount of misinformation that happens in our community. And again, there is a relationship between what happens and what is said in community and how that kind of shows up in our professional practice. So there are many sources of misinformation for this, for substance use. But at the community level, First Nations community level, I will just highlight these three. Addiction is a choice, and if you really loved me, you would stop using substances. Number two, we just need to kick out all the drug dealers in our community. That would solve the problem. And that's probably the most controversial myth that we can bust. And myth number three, all people who use substances are addicted. And then we back that by information. And you'll notice that I use the red map, blue map color codes here, because I often go to the red map, blue map to help gauge some of our intentions for talking about substance use and addiction. So the information to combat myth number one, addiction is a coping mechanism. And then we go back to the red map and say we don't wake up to and roll out of bed and continue to choose to be in a relationship with addiction. We use it to cope with, to feel good about bad stuff that's happened to us. Myth number two, kick out the drug dealers. The correct information there is that prohibition doesn't work. It is a failed experiment that has cost many lives and has done more harm than it has done good. There, for those of you who like to do research, historical research regarding health, we can trace prohibition policies back to their source of origin and find out if that origin has racist colonial ideology, and every single one of them will. But I invite you to do that research if that's within your means. When it comes to kicking out drug dealers at the community level, it is a microcosm of Canada's war on drugs. And that war on drugs is really a war on our own people, because drugs can't pick up a weapon and fight you back. And it's kind of like whack-a-mole. For those of you who know what whack-a-mole is, it's like the mole comes up and you kind of hit one down and then it kind of continues. And selling drugs is a business. And like any business, there's a supply and there's a demand. We can remove the supply by kicking out the drug dealer, but there's this whole demand that we haven't even begun to unpack yet, which is the red map, the roots causes of substance use and addiction. And then the last one is dismantling the misinformation about all people who use substances are addicted. The truth is that people use substances for many different reasons. I put into a medicine wheel, 4 different relationships we can have with substance use. We can be abstinent, we can use substances medicinally, we can use substances recreationally, and then of course we can have a relationship with addiction. So now I'm going to move into, and I'm going to pick up the pace here, and I apologize in advance, into Indigenous principles and practices of harm reduction. And really, this is where I'm going to get to the cultural safety aspects of decolonizing substance use and cultural safety strategies for service providers. I'm going to share with you at the community level what can happen, and of course, maybe what you can walk away with and learn more about, advocate for, or implement in your teams, in your sites, or within your services. Indigenous principles and practices of harm reduction are really making harm reduction hit home for each and every one of us, and a little bit more tangible, a little bit more relatable. So we use tradition and culture and the attitudes and actions to carry out our tradition and culture, but we make them relatable to the work of harm reduction. Because harm reduction is relatively new work to us as First Nations people. However, when we come to the attitudes and actions, we've been doing harm reduction all along. So when it comes to tradition and culture, our intergenerational strengths, we enjoy ceremony, medicine, hunting, storytelling, cedar work, speaking our language, and being together, celebrating, doing ceremony. And then of course, we all know what harm reduction looks like. It's needle distribution, safer injections, providing safer injection materials, providing safer smoking materials, condoms, substitution and moderation therapies. And then in the purple bubble there in the corner, you'll see that those are the attitudes and actions that it takes. I say coming from a place of mindful judgment. I'm not a fan of the use of the term non-judgmental, and we come across this all the time when we are supporting marginalized or vulnerable communities. We say, well, be non-judgmental to the folks you are serving. But can you turn your judgments off? No, we use our judgment on a moment-by-moment basis. Many of you are judging the words that are coming out of my mouth at this very second. So I ask people to check in with their judgments, lean into their judgments. Are they healthy or unhealthy about Indigenous people? Are they constructive or deconstructive about substance use? So check in with them and use your judgments. Compassion, inclusion, patience, developing relationships, education, and supporting people's human rights. Mindful judgment, I do like to leave this with folks too, because it's incredibly important in our professional practice. Mindful judgment is about checking in with your judgments about Indigenous people and substance use. It is a reflective technique to build the social emotional resilience in our own professional practice. Because cultural safety and substance use conversations are often, emotional for us as professionals if we're learning. And sometimes it's our emotional resilience where we disengage. So having that mindful judgment will help you engage with your own learning. Harm reduction is outlined with 4 key and prominent animal symbols in British Columbia: the wolf, the bear, the eagle, and the raven. And each animal will have a symbol that is attached to it that is directly related to harm reduction. So for the wolf, relationships and care. For the bear, strength and protection. For the eagle, knowledge and wisdom. And for the raven, identity and transformation. And then each animal will have a certain healing principle that goes along with it, fully recognizing that from colonization, we are all on our own healing journey. So for the wolf, healing requires working together as one heart and one mind. Here in the lower mainland, we have a saying that goes Natsamat, one heart and one mind. Or in Stolo territory, it's Latsamat. That notion of coming together and being one includes people who are using substances. Strength and protection, the bear. Healing is embedded in culture and tradition. Again, our intergenerational strengths. Harm reduction is very strength-based. From the eagle, knowledge and wisdom. Healing requires time, patience, and reflection. And for the raven, identity and transformation. Healing involves finding out who you are and accepting who you were. So breaking down some of the teachings that can go along with this. For the wolf, relationships and care, this looks like forming relationships and providing outreach to people who seek support. And it sounds like connecting with people who use substances over something other than their substance use. That's what we like to share at the community level. At a service provider level, so friends and colleagues, it's about engaging with the Indigenous community and engaging with people who are using substances and not resisting that. So checking with your mindful judgments, taking a healthy risk, a professional healthy risk, and engaging with that community. Committing to lifelong learning, but it's what you are learning, you're directly relating to your practice. So if you have newfound knowledge regarding cultural safety or people who use substances or destigmatizing people who use substances, using I words like I'm going to use this in my practice like this, and then define how that might look. And then of course it's rooted in interaction. For the bear, strength and protection, this looks like recognizing culture and tradition are intergenerational strengths and keep communities resilient. This sounds like practicing culture and tradition and maintaining connection and relationships. What we really emphasize here is what we call low barrier cultural activities, because as a result of colonization, colonial ideology and values have impacted some of our cultural value systems, like abstinence-only kind of cultures. So we ask to reduce those and have access to culture if you are on your healing journey and actively using substances. So Culture Saves Lives in the Downtown East Side is a champion for this work. At the service provider level, it's not just trauma-informed practice, it's trauma and resiliency-informed practice. Again, that knowledge in which you're speaking and learning and just focusing on Indigenous traumatic experiences and traumatic language is going to have an impact on your belief system and how you show up to this work. So don't forget to include the resiliency aspect of how we are still here and all of the intergenerational strengths that we still know and operate and mobilize and share today. But it's also about cultural advocacy. So I say cultural advocacy is like going above and beyond the call of duty. So it's not just being culturally safe. It's like when when there's no Indigenous people in the room and you're at a decision-making table, you're going to use your voice and your position to advocate for cultural safety and advancing cultural safety and humility at that table, and not needing permission to do so. And then, of course, it's decolonizing the institution. For the eagle, knowledge and wisdom, this looks like meeting people where they're at on their healing journey and being mindful about where we are at on our own healing journey. And this sounds like providing good information and resources and actively working to reduce stigma and being mindful about the way we talk about substance use. At the service provider level, it's our commitment to lifelong learning. I know that, in healthcare, we are quite often socialized or conditioned into, taking a course and then completing the course and then having the sense that we are now competent in that newfound skill. But when it comes to the effective domain learning, which is changing your attitudes about certain things, it really is a lifelong commitment. I say cultural safety is a practice, not perfection. It's a journey, not a destination. And if you have the wherewithal and the means and the intentions inside yourselves, it is, making that commitment and letting people know and inviting your friends and colleagues to make that same commitment. It is having a focus on human rights and social justice lenses rather than good, bad, binary, or the morality of colonial ideology. And then, of course, becoming Indigenous accomplices. I know that allyship is also a thing that's out there, but again, going above and beyond allyship is really being an accomplice. that our fates are joined, that what happens to us is going to have an effect on other citizens that we share this planet with. The Raven, identity and transformation. This looks like providing ongoing opportunities for compassion and inclusion along the healing journey. And this sounds like acknowledging that substance use is a journey, with abstinence not always being the end goal. Maybe the end goal is substitution. So replacing one substance for something that is deemed to be less harmful. Maybe the end goal for the individual is moderation. So reducing the frequency in the consumption of the substance that they choose to consume. And at the service provider level, it's about indigenizing our physical spaces. Cultural safety is not just something we know, it's something we evoke, we live it, we breathe it, and then it's how we transform our physical spaces too. Because cultural safety is not just what I know, it's how I can transform our spaces. And think about, how you interpret as a human being what is safe and what is not safe. And quite often, our physical spaces speak volumes to whether or not that is a safe place. So I say indigenizing spaces, and that looks like having visualization or some representation of the Indigenous community with an emphasis on the lands and territories in which that space is built. So do you have a territory acknowledgement plaque? Do you have traditional medicines accessible to your patients or clients? Do you have Indigenous artwork that is purchased or collaborated with in partnership from artists from the local territory? And then recruitment and retention is actively recruiting Indigenous knowledge keepers, Indigenous professionals who are versed in this work. For a long time, other programs and services in any institution would rely solely on the labor of Indigenous departments in that same institution. And real cultural safety and real reconciliation is making your own investments into creating your own positions. So hiring your own liaisons, hiring your own cultural advisors, hiring your own elders to be on your staff. If you have a significant amount of Indigenous clients and people who are accessing your services, then why not make that investment and take ownership over that service? And then, of course, it's focusing on an Indigenous focused health equity lens. People always say, well, regardless of culture, we treat everybody the same. No, we don't. And we have data and research to prove that. Equity has been around for a long time, and diversity has been around for a long time. But we know in the Indigenous community that has not really done a lot for us. And that is has a direct relationship to Canadian socialization. That, because we operate within a system that has rooted in colonial ideology, that impacts us a lot different than other marginalized communities who are non-Indigenous in this country. So it's not just having an equity-oriented lens. It's not just having a diversity-oriented lens. It is having an Indigenous-focused health equity lens. Because if we just throw in Indigenous cultural safety into the same pot or the same cedar basket as diversity and inclusivity, we get lost in that again. So it's making it focused. So cultural safety and humility in substance use services really looks like embedding it wherever we possibly can. Where are there opportunities to embed it? Whether it's in your partnerships and relationships or the policy standards of practice, again, your human resources, your staff experiences, education and training, governance and administration. Haitsep thank you all for having me. I'm going to close this now and stop sharing and come back to you all.
Thank you so much, Len. That was amazing. I was scribbling so many notes. You have so much important knowledge to share. We have a few questions. Wow. Yeah. While I was on mute, we were talking in the room, and some of my colleagues were saying you should hear him speak live because you have such a presence and so much knowledge. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. I have a question from the chat here, and this question is, do you have advice on how to reframe or reprogram institutional or decision makers focus on numerical data, you know, that always that need to have the empirical evidence and the stats to back things up.
Mhm.
How can we decolonize that?
Mm-hmm.
That's a tough one.
That is a tough one. And I really think that that needs to be an ongoing conversation with our peers, with our colleagues. How do we decolonize data sharing and so that people don't just become numbers? Because again, we can become desensitized to that kind of data, to numbers. So I would encourage to continue, those of you who were kind of having that similar kind of question in your mind, bring that out, evoke that into your practice. How do we decolonize this? And then again, I would invite, you know, all friends and colleagues in this work and have an interest and a passion for this work to use decolonization and use that in your everyday vocabulary and incorporate that into your professional practice. Because there is this misassumption or this misconception that decolonization is for Indigenous people solely. No, decolonization has, you know, a tremendous benefit for all of us as Canadian citizens in this country.
Yes, absolutely. There's so much that's caught up with the numbers. I mean, today, look at the numbers in our drug poisoning epidemic, right? And how we have insurmountable numbers, and we have that empirical evidence, yet still we don't have the political will and the awareness and the commitment to step up. And so, I mean, we have to think differently about how we're going to provide services. Mm-hmm. I have a question here from the chat. Someone says, I'd enjoy hearing more about becoming an accomplice rather than an ally. So sort of that working in solidarity piece, I think. Mm-hmm. The person says, I think I hold a negative assumption about the word accomplice, and we'll have to shed that. Mm. So yeah.
Sure, I think that there's no easy way around that one. There is a much bigger conversation that's happening on what term do we use for working together. And I've struggled with it within my own circles in where I speak and share knowledge. Do we say Indigenous allyship? Do we say Indigenous accomplices? Do we say champions? Do we say ambassadors? So whatever, and really the work is pretty much the same. And it is kind of political, like a social, political, peer-to-peer, group-to-group. There's politics in it a little bit. And I think that it doesn't necessarily need to be a title. It needs to be a behavior. It needs to be an action. It's not what you identify as, it's how you show up to this work. So call yourself what you may. Don't self-proclaim to be it, but do let it be reflected in your knowledge, in your presence, in your participation, and in your advocacy. Those are the things that, you know, allyship and ambassadorship and championship all have in common, is how you show up to this work. You know, what you are called, I don't think isn't necessarily the most important aspect. It's how you show up. And what we do need, regardless, is people to share this workload. The labor and the work no longer needs to fall on Indigenous shoulders to have these conversations. So we need people to show up in a good way and do their part. And call yourself what you may, just don't self-declare it.
Absolutely. It's not a label that folks can give themselves. I wholeheartedly agree. I think it's more about persevering and having a personal investment in solidarity, working alongside folks, right? It's not saving people. It's more about doing the work and showing up and making relationships. So thank you so much for that, Len. We're just following the chat a little more. We've got another question here. Someone is really focusing on the statement you made from Bruce Alexander about how connection is the opposite of addiction. And that's a common theme in this field. Someone citing also Gabor Mate. And they're asking, how do we name this as a decolonized approach while also not excluding non-Indigenous clients who have experienced trauma?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, was that not experienced trauma?
Who have experienced trauma. My mistake, sorry.
Yeah, and you know, and this is something that I have done many times. I know that red map is within an Indigenous context. But with 3 easy adjustments, that concept map can be relative to greater Canadian society. We can take out residential schools and put in children who have experienced early childhood trauma, because those residues of fear and shame, isolation, and learned helplessness can still be there and be impacted by early childhood trauma. We can take out the 60 scoop and put it children who have grown up in foster care system and then aged out of the system, because they can have a sense of loss of rights and a detachment as well. And for land theft, we can take that out and put in a non-Indigenous context, say people who have grown up without a home, people who have lived in a car or a van or couch surfed, you know, for their entire youth years, because they can have poverty and lack of freedom and loss of housing. And then it all kind of, the rest of the red map will kind of continue to coincide with those different experiences.
I agree. It's a very adaptable model that you've got there. And I think when we lift one group up, we lift everyone up, especially when that group is one of the most marginalized groups, right?
I think that one of the things that I like to emphasize within decolonial practices is that, and cultural safety for that matter, is that it's not just about, you know, making practicing humility in making safer spaces and understanding Indigenous people. It's actually leaning into the conversation a little bit more and asking ourselves, what can we learn from Indigenous worldviews? What can we learn from Indigenous experiences? Because we've been under so many aspects of oppression and segments of colonial policy and ideology that we've learned and exercise our resilience, exercise our strength, and come out of it. And are resisting and fighting it every single day, we have a thing or two, we have lessons that we can share with the world on progressing, on moving, on advancing, and more importantly, transforming.
Absolutely. One of our speakers yesterday, Dr. Kiawe Kahololoka, Dr. Kiawe Kaholokula, I wrote it down, I'm sorry, Hawaiian names are hard. And he was talking about, you know, the different views between an Indigenous worldview and more of a colonized or a settler worldview. He referred to it as cultural safety and settler safety, as settler safety being kind of the status quo, and how you can reframe things with an Indigenous worldview that is so much more empowering and resilient and connected with each other, and bringing in humanity, rather focusing on the group rather than on the individual. So yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. We have one more question. We have a couple more questions here. This one is, let's see. Would you encourage having land-based healing built into substance use services across BCH? Or is that the kind of programming that's more specific to communities and nations, and maybe more appropriate to be offered within First Nations communities? What are your thoughts?
I think that there is an incredible value in land-based healing. And I think that that is rooted in Indigenous worldviews as well. It's rooted in our value system, and we see it in our knowledge-based systems. We know that the land, the territory can heal us. And so that's why we have, you know, rocks, plants, medicines, water, especially in Coast Salish territory. Water is very healing for us. So that is a value. And I know that there are lots of emerging studies and research in just the value of land-based healing for people who use substances, and for youth who have experienced trauma, youth in recovery, anybody. So it's to me, it's while we have known this since the beginning of time, science has a funny way of just catching up to Indigenous knowledge much later in the game.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I do think that because, and sometimes we see it as separate, right? It's like there's all this science and research, and we've just known these things for a long time. And a classic example of, I don't know if anybody's ever heard of All My Relations. You know, we recognize in our Indigenous worldview, we're all connected. We're, not just us as human beings, but we're connected to plants and animals and the universe and the cosmos. And then, I don't know, later in science catches up and says, well, you know, on a anatomical level and a molecular level, we're all interconnected. And Indigenous people are like, no kidding. So for land-based healing, you know, I do think that it is important that we decolonize our healthcare systems to get out of our institutional walls and get out onto the territory. Because as human beings, we're all hurting in that kind of regard. We're so detached from land. We are so detached from the environment. And if that detachment continues, the future citizens of this planet, you know, won't have that relationship to be able to understand that they need to use their voice to speak up for Mother Earth and defend for the future generations. So I think wherever we can advocate for land-based healing services and restore that connection will have a greater impact, not just for Indigenous folks, but for the future citizens of the planet.
I agree. You know, I feel like science, well, as a white person, I've heard it referred to often as Columbusing, that idea that, oh, we've just discovered this thing that Indigenous people have known for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, right? And and I'm hoping we're at that point where we're gonna come to realize that Indigenous ways of healing have such great value and so important. Okay. Oh, the chat is really just blowing up over here. I'm trying to follow through. How do we go about instilling this sense of education and community throughout the communities, the Indigenous community sharing their learnings and experiences, as our health systems are complicated to navigate? How can we produce such a program or session?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Read it again.
Thank you.
How do we go about instilling this sense of education and community to promote such a program or session? Because Indigenous communities are so wonderful at sharing their learnings and experiences.
I'm not sure. I'm having a hard time comprehending the question, so I apologize.
Maybe I'll rephrase it. So,
okay, sure.
I think the person is asking, how do we create a program or a group or session that instills this Indigenous worldview when our health systems are already so colonized?
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. I think that, and I come across this all the time too when I facilitate conversations on cultural safety. People ask me, well, Len, you know, I don't want to appropriate Indigenous culture. I'm like, that's okay. There are ways that we can work together. Definitely, we don't want to appropriate Indigenous knowledge, stories, methods, but there are some, I like to land on values. If we can transform our colonial values to make room for Indigenous values, and there's lots of ways that we can go about that. Inclusivity is and having a holistic approach, you know, is an Indigenous worldview. So I say it's not so much about the practice in itself, because that can be appropriated by colonial or non-Indigenous systems. But you can get an access and mobilize Indigenous values into frameworks, mobilize Indigenous values into policies, procedures, and ways that we conduct our businesses. So a good example is, you know, in modern day society, or a corporate culture, because as healthcare, we have a very corporate culture. During the pandemic, you know, it was so traumatizing to hear leaders say to frontline healthcare staff, you know, self-care. We're in a crisis, you're stretched as it is, don't forget to take care of yourself, which is already isolating as it is. But that's a very corporate idea, a corporate value is self-care. In a very Indigenous worldview, in a cultural sense, the value that we can mobilize in our teams is, how do we instill community care with our institution and with our teams? So how can we kind of come together and take care of each other during a crisis, so that you're not going alone, you know, back home and isolating yourself and just asking you to take care of yourself? How can we check in with one another? Hey, how are you doing today? How can I take care of you? How can I have your back? And for leaders to do, you know, emotional social check-ins. How are you showing up to work today? Because it's not just our clever minds that we bring to this work, it's our wholehearted selves. It's our restless emotions, our strong spirits, and our physical selves that we take to this work too.
Absolutely. Yeah, I see folks are commenting on what you're saying. It's more like making space for the values, and someone's saying maybe it's a better way to not have corporate values leading us. Maybe have community values leading us, right? Wonderful. Let's see. I have time for one last question, if that's okay, if you have time, Len.
Yeah.
Great. This person's asking, can you speak to the use of psychoactive substances in ceremony or ritual among Indigenous communities on Turtle Island since time immemorial, things like ayahuasca, psilocybin, and whether taking a decolonized approach to harm reduction and substance use has revitalized conversations around the potential benefits of using these substances within ceremony and community? Where are we at with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. But I haven't come across this in my journey to date around that. And I think that's because of my own where my two cultural feet stand in Coast Salish territory and with my Coast Salish identity. I haven't come across, at least in my journey so far, any access to, psychoactive substances as in terms of ceremony yet. I don't know, but again, I'm always in a constant state of learning about my own Coast Salish history and what has not been impacted and what has been impacted culturally, because so it's a constant state of discovery. And I'm sorry, I don't have much to offer in that regard regarding ayahuasca and the cactus plants by Indigenous relatives, in different parts of Turtle Island. Yeah, so I'm afraid I can't speak to that.
That's
but
fine.
I appreciate the question.
It is an interesting question, for sure. We've had some really lovely questions today. You've generated so much excitement and interest with folks. And I think that the model that you've described is so easily translatable into the way that we design our programs and services. We just have to shift that core mindset, that colonial way of thinking, the colonial lens that's on all of our healthcare systems and all of our other systems too, for that matter. I want to thank you so much again today, Len, for your teachings and sharing your knowledge with us. What a gift. I feel really honored to be able to chat with you. I think we're going to turn it over now to our next session. So yes, if you have further questions, we can try and answer them through our ICS training at bchemail.ca or at bch.ca, sorry. Yeah, and so now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Avanti Hawk, and say thank you so much to Len.